they don't actually argue against ideas. They just argue against the people who espouse those ideas. Hello, my name is Todd Shannon, data scientist, social commentator, and getter of buckets. And this is Who Cares What Todd Thinks vlog. Well, what are we talking about today? We are going to continue our critiques of the Southside Rabbis. Now, if you haven't seen the first video, I will put the link somewhere, the end card somewhere where you can find it. I highly encourage you to have a gander at that video because it lays the foundation for a lot of the things that we are going to talk about. But in general, I talk about how the whole idea of not being consistent, being hypocritical, can really be the primary and the chief barrier to us communicating with people with whom we disagree. Right. And so that was kind of my main thrust. I had examples. It's a hoot. It's long, but it's worth it. Right. Now we're going to continue to really look at, besides the hypocrisy thing, I want to look at the substance of some of the arguments that KB and Ameen make in their videos. And so without further ado, let's get right into it. One of the real problems that I have with KB and Ameen's approach in their Southside Rabbi vlog is their method of argumentation. I find their method of argumentation to be lacking in several areas. And in particular, the way they construct their arguments is really, really poor. It's really important that people be, whenever you're presuming to teach someone, whenever you're presuming to give someone something that they can build on personally, it's really important that you construct your arguments properly, right? So one of the comments that I read on one of their videos was somebody making a comment where they said, man, wisdom is just oozing out of these brothers. And while I can respect that level of appreciation that person had for KB and Ameen, I can say respectfully that I disagree strongly, particularly with respect to these topics where they talk about race and politics. I found their arguments to be lacking. One of the biggest problems that I had was when KB and Ameen start to make an argument that was presumably against someone's kind of the pushback that they get when someone says, well, you're employing ideas that are not founded in biblical ideas, right? So once again, this kind of goes back to the claims about Marxism, cultural Marxism. I pointed out in the last video how KB explicitly employed an idea from liberation theology, which is not found in the text, when he talks about the profile of the poor as who God prefers. And, not only is the Bible oozing with counterexamples that, for example, Abraham, who was one of the great patriarchs, that guy wasn't poor. David, that guy wasn't poor. I could go on and on. There were many people in the New Testament who God loved and had great affection for. There's no proof at all in the Bible that God prefers the poor, right? That God has a leaning toward the poor. In fact, in Leviticus 19, it says precisely the opposite. You will not pervert justice. You will not show partiality to the poor, nor favoritism to the great. And so that was the way I refuted his idea. And that's the way I think you ought to refute an idea. But we're going to watch a clip where KB and Ameen do not do this. And I'm going to point out to you why I really cannot accept this kind of argumentation.
Baked in to what it means to be the United States of America.
Facts.
And now as we are trying to pull the United States away from that,
right,
it almost feels like people feel like we're almost pulling the United States away from its American values in and of itself,
right,
which shows you why a lot of American values are racially tinged. And for Christians, you trying to pull them away from this idea of nationalism and Americanism and even whiteness being baked into Christianity feels like you're pulling them away from Christianity.
Wow.
So that's why they're like, you guys are breaking the faith.
Right.
You guys are compromising fidelity to the Bible.
Right.
You guys are compromising the gospel.
Right.
Because pulling you away from your idea of race in America feels like we're pulling you away from Christianity.
From Jesus. Literally.
Which is a testimony to how incestuous the relationship between Americanism
Wow.
and race is in the nation.
Right.
That when we're trying to pull those things apart from what the Bible shows as a biblical racial ethic, and then we're trying to describe all of the reality of what is happening as far as race in this country, historically and present day, that it feels like we're pulling you away from Orthodox Christianity.
Wow.
And now you're like, oh my gosh, they're threatening the church.
They're trying to persecute
Which
us.
is the same thing that the Southerners said during the Civil Rights, Civil War debate.
For word.
They said that these folks, that these abolitionists that are trying to come in and cancel slavery as an institution are threatening the fidelity of the church. And their theology that they're giving around justice is literally threatening the Orthodox theology that we have around race in the church, and period. They literally saw the abolitionists as heretics. And it's so crazy because you had abolitionists that were saying, we agree with you with the authority of the Bible. We agree with you with all of the Orthodox theology that you have. We agree with you by salvation coming by grace through faith. We agree with you about depravity. We agree with you that Jesus is the only way. We agree with you regarding election. We agree with you around all of these things. Where we disagree with you is slavery because of what the Bible says about justice.
Right.
And then they came in and said, guys, all of their teaching about justice is threatening theological purity.
Yes.
Okay, so that was maybe a longer clip than I intended to play, but let's deconstruct this a little bit, because basically the claim is this. They're trying to validate their activism, right? They're trying to validate their particular brand of social justice, right? And they're saying, responding to the pushback they often get, which I pointed out in the first video, the employment of cultural Marxism, damnable heresies like liberation theology, which they borrow from. When someone points that out, then what they want to say is, well, that's the same sort of things that the Southerners who wanted to own slaves said whenever the abolitionists came to them and said, they shouldn't be doing this, that you shouldn't be doing this, right? So this rhetorically and on an emotional level may sound like a good argument, but what you should realize is that they actually haven't made an argument, right? They haven't explained, right, why specifically the person who makes the claim that they are employing ideas that are extra biblical, why they are wrong. You see, it's just like I did once again when KB made the comment in the last video that that the profile of the downtrodden and the poor was who God preferred. And I took him to Leviticus 19, right, as a direct refutation of that, as well as also examples in the scriptures of people who were quite wealthy, who God had quite the affinity and affection for, right? Saying that, now just imagine if I had done, instead of doing that, if I had said something like this, I say, hey, KB, you're saying things that are rooted in cultural Marxism. And then KB says, no, it's not. I'm not, this is biblical justice. And then I come back and say, well, that's what, the Marxist Soviet, Russia used to say. It's like, so, and yeah, that's exactly the sort of response that I would expect if I were to say something like that. If I were to use that method, that poor method of argumentation, saying what somebody who was wrong in their general ideologies said, or saying that, well, that's the same sort of thing so-and-so said. That's not an argument, right? You have to roll up your sleeves and do the hard work of actually demonstrating why something is wrong, right? So what I expected, instead of well, that's what the slave owners told the abolitionists, I would have expected a actual maybe biblical reference, some pointing to the scriptures, with that maybe the abolitionists were making the point, hey, it says right here in the scriptures that kidnappers and man stealers are doing something wicked, they put in the same category as murderers and thieves and things like that. And that's what these people come from. These people were stolen. Anything that you think that is valid about slavery in the Bible, whatever you think is valid about slavery in the Bible, it doesn't apply to these people. And so that sort of method of argumentation and the actual details that matter, not saying, oh, that's what the Southerners said about the abolitionists. That's not an argument. So the point that I'm making is that KB and Ameen's method of argumentation is actually, if I can put it this way, it's a little bit sophomoric. It kind of relies on these kind of grand assertions and all of these things where they don't actually say specifically why their opponents are wrong. And that is not acceptable. But on another note, we can kind of piggyback off of that, because I think that there's a very, this is just my personal opinion, there's a reason why I think they argue this way, right? They make these claims, and this is something that that the left does often, because people on the left don't actually have good ideas, in my opinion. They don't actually have ideas that they can argue for and establish to be superior to the ones that are being offered as counter principles against their ideology. So, for example, here KB and Ameen took all this time to talk about how, we have to separate the nationalism and the Americanism. Well, one of the things that is important for many people who are Christians in this nation is the idea that the philosophical underpinnings of our nation, those that are enumerated in the Declaration of Independence and in the Constitution, those ideas are so foundational to our nation's founding, and they're also, and this is what I believe, they're also very, very compatible with Christian doctrine, with Christian ideology. As a matter of fact, many of the people early on who established the Constitution, many of these men were theologians. Some of them were people who were well read and well studied in the scriptures. So when we get this kind of construct of our government, the ideas that undergird it, we find are important because they are compatible with the scriptures. But you see, on the left, they don't really argue against those ideas. You don't see anybody refuting something Thomas Jefferson wrote in the Declaration of Independence. You don't see them saying why the First, Second, and Third Amendment aren't good ideas. What you hear them saying is things like, oh, well, did you know that Thomas Jefferson raped one of his slaves? Right? Did you know that Abraham Lincoln was, even though he freed the slave, did you know that he still didn't like black people? Which is something that KB actually said in one of his videos, which is actually the first time I've ever heard anything like that. I didn't even take the time to look it up to see if it was true, right? So my point is that they don't actually argue against ideas. They just argue against the people who espouse those ideas. They say, well, I'm not even going to try to deconstruct why the idea is wrong. I'm just going to tell you that the person who wrote that was a bad person. And that sort of argumentation is kind of a representative or an example of what's called the genetic fallacy, where you try to invalidate an idea because of where it came from. Right? The genetic fallacy is one of those kind of informal fallacies in logic that any kind of first-year philosophy student would learn, right? It's like the ABCs of how to construct a valid argument. You can't say that an argument is invalid because an immoral person came up with it. You have to actually explain why the idea that you are trying to refute is wrong. This is so the method of argumentation has a lot of emotional appeal to people who don't really understand that they're kind of being emotionally manipulated, because it's easy to point to someone if they themselves had done something very bad. It's easy to point to them and say, well, look at that bad thing they did. You shouldn't listen to anything that they say. An interesting and maybe it's still probably a sore spot for many of us is even with Brother Ravi Zacharias, who's obviously passed away now. But when we found out that Ravi Zacharias was living such an immoral life, right? It makes it difficult to accept all of his teachings. But before we knew that was going on in his life, no one had any problems with what he was saying. And that's because even though he had those issues in his life, and even though he may have been an immoral man, that just doesn't have anything to do with whether or not the arguments he presented about God were valid and founded upon scriptures and also upon valid logic. It just the two just don't have anything to do with each other. So in summary, what people who are left-leaning tend to do is they tend to argue against people. They tend to say, so-and-so, they tend to employ the genetic fallacy often. So-and-so was a bad person, therefore, this Americanism, we got to get rid of it. It's like, well, can you tell me why we should be rejecting the Declaration of Independence? What's wrong with the First Amendment? What's wrong with the Second Amendment? How is that specifically not compatible with the scriptures? Right? Because if you're not telling me how specifically that happens to be the case, then you're just really you're just employing an argument that just doesn't hold any water. And this sort of argumentation is rampant in KB and Ameen's proceedings throughout their podcasts and out their vlogs. So this is one of the major problems that I have with their content. One of the things that KB and Ameen do, pretty often in their talks is they mentioned several times, they talked about the concept of whiteness, divesting from whiteness. And I have a really serious problem with first of all, the use of that term. To give you an idea, once again, this is, in my opinion, another kind of deployment of critical race theory, cultural Marxism, and it comes from the concept of hegemony. Hegemony means that there is a dominant culture, right, in a society, and the people who have the hegemony, they basically they set the rules for that society in such a way as to benefit themselves and I guess de facto oppress and marginalize everyone else, right? So this whole idea of hegemony, which is a kind of once again an idea found in critical race theory, is what they call whiteness. That's a now what specifically whiteness is in a sense of what those specific rules that are supposed to benefit white people and not benefit other people, they do not say, which is, once again, frustrating because it's quite typical. They tend to, once again, speak in these kind of general terms all the time without really defining them, which makes it more difficult to critique. But once again, if I'm just using the classic ideas of hegemony, of critical race theory, I think I know what they mean, right? And here's the problem that I have with that. First of all, the idea that a culture which is dominant, where they set up, quote, the rules of society to benefit them and to marginalize others, don't get me wrong, that's definitely a thing that's possible. It is definitely something that was without question the case all the way up until recent history in the United States. I mean, obviously, the Civil Rights Act didn't pass till the 1960s, where basically legal segregation, marginalization, and discrimination was on the books. All the laws allowed it. It wasn't even illegal that black people could be treated differently. And I think that in that situation, we see how those kind of rough categories of whiteness, I suppose, which once again, I object to the term, but the idea behind it, I understand. It's basically partiality. It's racism. That's the term. or partiality is the term that the Bible uses, and it's partiality on the basis of race, right? This is obviously unjust. This is obviously wrong. We all understand that, right? But to classify it as a whiteness is a bit of a double-edged sword, because what it implies, this is really important to understand, what it implies, and there again, this may not be what they mean specifically, but I'm just giving you my assessment, is that somehow this sort of racism and this hegemony, right, is something that is, or this establishing of hegemony through these nefarious means of rigging the system, is some inherent characteristic of being white, right? You're tying this sort of really universal heart issue, which anyone is quite capable of having, right? Any culture is capable of demonstrating. Even blacks in certain other cultures have a certain hegemony over other blacks, and they could quite possibly rig the system to benefit them and to marginalize others. It's a thing. It's just not something that is inherent to white people. So to call it whiteness, I understand what you're trying to say, well, you're trying to communicate a principle, but I object to the term. Now, the words we use matter, right? Because let's just take this idea, first, before I even do that, I want to, as I always like to do, I always like to give you receipts. Let's listen to KB and Ameen. Let's listen to what they say about this so-called whiteness.
If you're from Germany, if you're from Poland, if you're from Ireland, like Conor McGregor, and you want to raise your Irish flag, I have no problem with that, bro.
Ethnicity is real.
God celebrates ethnicity. You should celebrate it.
God created ethnicity.
I'm all for it, but you should, as my sister Ekemini Uwan said, and y'all can email me if you would like to, divest from whiteness as a social construct.
Yes, it's.
We're not asking you to divest from your ethnicity. We're asking you to divest from the social construct of whiteness.
Right. Because even
now, once again, whiteness. What specifically is that? Divest from the social construct of whiteness. What is that specifically? I suppose once again it's some sort of thing where the rules are set up to specifically to benefit white people and not to benefit others. Again, that's an idea straight out of critical race theory, and particularly in our society today, I think the case can be made that society is set up in the opposite way. I mean, you think about all of the programs, the affirmative action, all the billions and the war on poverty, the urban housing and development projects, all of these scholarships and different things that you can get that white people can't get, right? The idea, the simplistic idea that society is set up specifically to benefit white people to the detriment of other people groups is just not true of today's society. And to wrap it in the idea of whiteness, right, is something that I have a difficult time accepting. And if you're resisting what I'm saying right now, and you tend to be someone who agrees with KB and Ameen on this issue, let's just flip it. Sometimes all you have to do is flip the situation to where now we are taking some negative aspect that may or may not be prevalent in the black community, and then we're going to would you be comfortable with some white person telling you that you need to divest from blackness, right? And by blackness, what they mean is some sort of pathology that might be present in greater degrees in the black community than they are, say, in other communities. Like, for example, fatherlessness, violent crime, things of that nature. If someone were to take those negative attributes that tend to be prevalent in the black community, those really terrible things, and then classify them as blackness, would you not take offense? would you not say that that's racist? Would you not say that that is employing a pejorative on the basis of race that is not true in reality? Right? You see, if it's good for the goose, it's good for the gander, right? If you're going to be okay with classifying negative aspects of, say, race and racial disparities and things like that, if you're going to classify that in terms of whiteness, right? Because racism is a sort of pathology, right? It's a negative thing. It's something that erodes society in general. Well, so does violent crime. So does fatherlessness, right? Would you be okay with someone classifying that as blackness? I don't think so. I think you'd be all over that. I think you'd be calling for that person to be tarred and feathered if they ever tried to coin a term called blackness that referred specifically to the pathology in the black community. You would reject that, as you should. As you should. But I think that actually gives me a good segue, because that gives me an opportunity to address a material misrepresentation that KB made in this podcast. And it goes to show, once again, it kind of undergirds the idea that I was talking about before about the hypocrisy and the double standards. So let's hear what KB has to say about fatherlessness in the black community.
Yet, what we have seen around the issue of fatherlessness in the black community, which, by the way, is an issue in all communities, okay?
Not specifically black. The issue in
fatherlessness is a problem in America.
Right.
It's a Western problem.
It's an issue in a lot of poor communities.
Right. And it's...
This is a material misrepresentation. It's a problem in every community. It's one of those things that, let me be careful about this. It's one of those things that are true but also misleading. When we talk about fatherlessness in the black community, we don't mean to say that it doesn't exist in other communities. What we are saying, and what is true, is that fatherlessness is an acute problem in the black community. It's an acute problem. It exists in a greater degree, and it has a more devastating impact on the black community than it does other places. Now, that's a material fact. Now, the idea that KB is trying to skirt and he's trying to get around is the idea that fatherlessness in the black community is that, in fact, that acute problem that it is, as if to say it's the same everywhere. There's a similar argument made when we talk about black on black crime. They say, well, all crime, is, every community, has, white on, there's white on white crime, there's black on black crime. Every community commits violence against, members of its own community, right? Which is true. But what people are trying to, what they're trying to deny and what they're trying to minimize is that in the black community, for example, only in the black community is homicide among the leading causes of death. Among young black males, homicide is one of the top causes of death among young black men. It's higher than drunk driving, suicide, all of those things. But in all of those other communities, that is not the case. The homicide rate in the black community is like 6 times higher than whites and Latinos combined. It is a significant problem in the black community. Black people make up about 13 to 14% of the U.S. population, and we account for half of the homicides. Just think about that. White people account for about 60% of the nation's population. That means there's at least 4 times as many white people in our nation as there are black people. And we have as many homicides in the black community as there are in the white community. Almost as many. To try to pretend like it's not a more acute problem in our community is a material misrepresentation. Now, I don't want to say that it's a lie, right? I can't speak to KB's state of mind. I don't know if he is intending to to minimize a real problem. But another thing he says in his podcast or in one of his episodes is that something to the effect of that, we people try to weaponize the fatherlessness issue. It's not an issue of weaponizing. It's about recognizing material facts. And when we see this sort of, once again, an employment of a double standard, and then we are obviously saying, well, we're okay with calling the pathologies that exist in white communities that might be prevalent there. We don't have any problem calling that whiteness, but are we going to call homicide and crime and fatherlessness, we're going to call that blackness? This is about the way we present information and whether we are presenting information in a way that is logically valid and that doesn't cause the listener to reach a conclusion that they wouldn't otherwise reach had we not presented them with that information that may be flawed in its logic or a material misrepresentation of the facts. Regardless of what his objective is, whether it's just to protect the dignity of black people, that's maybe what he thinks he's doing, it doesn't change the fact that that's a material misrepresentation, right? And I think that there's something that people are trying to avoid, because what we have to do, and this is why this goes back to being able to create a solid logical argument, to understand how arguments are constructed, because it is my opinion that when people do things like this, when they try to kind of skirt the facts, they think that, for example, to point out the fact that fatherlessness, crime is particularly high and acute in the black communities is to say that there is some causal relationship between being black and those things, right? And what they're trying to do is they're trying to avoid giving credence to some of the negative stereotypes that people in the white community or many people who are racist tried to put on us falsely, and tried to say things like black people are inferior, black people are inherently this, inherently that. Those things were false. And so in order to try to avoid giving them fodder for their arguments, they say things like, or they try to deny material facts, right? But what we have to be mature enough to do is we have to be able to acknowledge the material fact, because honesty and truth-telling is an important principle among Christ followers. What we have to be able to do is we have to be able to parse and understand the difference between recognizing a correlation and a causal relationship. And everyone tries to pretend like they understand that causality, correlation does not equal causality. People say that like they understand it, but when it comes down to actually employing a mental discipline of understanding how that applies, we see that people don't do that. People assume the causal relationship by acknowledging the material fact. There's no causal relationship. Being black doesn't make you inherently more criminal or much less likely to be a good father. None of that is true. What we're talking about, we're not talking about inherent, innate characteristics. What we're talking about is culture. And culture is changeable. Ideas are changeable. The things that we try to employ and the tools that we use to try to change and transform our society, none of those things are inherent to our person or to our personhood. And we have to be disciplined enough to understand the difference between causality and correlation and orient ourselves toward the truth. I want to give you maybe just one more example of how this really plays out and why it's a dangerous game to play when you can't bring yourself to acknowledge material facts. There's a clip where KB and Ameen are discussing whether or not, for example, rap music contributes, or hip-hop music contributes to violence and violent crime. And even though it's painfully obvious that there's a contributory factor, when we talk about a multivariate analysis of what causal relationships are, we can't put it on any particular thing. There are a lot of things that contribute to it, but the idea, I can remember, for example, being a young kid listening to all of this was back in the mid to early 90s, when the real hardcore, violent, glorifying the drug culture, that's when hip hop started to change toward that. Because when I was a small kid, say when I was like 9, 10 years old, rap wasn't like that. Rap was party music. Then it became about drugs and violence and smoking weed. And I remember the change in my attitude towards those things after listening to that stuff, to that nonsense for years and years and years as a teenager. I remember the change in my attitude, and that's an anecdotal example. When people go around saying they're going to murder a bunch of people and being proud of being murderers and drug dealers and all of that stuff, when people glorify that, are you telling me that that doesn't contribute to the culture of criminality and violence? Well, obviously it does. We're not going to say it's the main cause, but KB does everything in his power to basically deny that and try not to admit it. Let's have a quick look.
Hip hop, in a lot of ways, has personified the brokenness.
Oh, absolutely.
When you have people who are naming themselves savage and all their raps about them acting like savages,
right.
literally using the language of your oppressors,
right,
in your brand name
and who you are, branding
this is
yourself,
who I am.
branding yourself as
you
a savage.
can't take me anywhere. I'll shoot up any place.
Right.
This is who they think you are.
Right.
Even if you can argue that hip hop is not actually accelerating crime in neighborhoods,
they're still a part of it.
Now, let me just say this. There hasn't been a lot of work done on that. There aren't a lot of studies that actually show the increase. Because when Chief Keef said, I'm putting out this mixtape to raise the murder rate in Chicago.
Right. Which is terrible.
He laid out his hand. He said, these are my intentions. That kind of attitude, if not said explicitly, is implicit in a lot of hip hop.
Right.
Is it actually doing? A lot of folk like Bizzle, for example, would say it is doing that.
Right.
Well, there's still studies that need to come out to show the causation and not just the correlation.
Right.
Now note the interesting, careful use of language. On the one hand, it's almost like he wants to acknowledge that it's a negative influence, but then he goes, oh, but jury's still out. Jury's still out on that. Right? And notice early on he talked about, we can't be doing that. We're using the language of our oppressor. You see, you can see that there's that uncomfortable thing he's trying to avoid, the giving fodder to people who are racist and who think that that's some sort of inherent characteristic. But once again, that's why we have to have the discipline, the mental discipline, and the logical capacity to understand that acknowledging the material fact that these things are negative impacts on our culture, that we are participating in these things at higher rates than people in other cultures and other communities, that does not imply in any way, shape, or form, or that does not mean in any way, shape, or form that that's somehow inherent to who we are. That's just not a thing, right? But I'll end it on this. While he goes through all these contortions trying to minimize the impact of this obviously negative music, when you have people saying explicitly that they want to increase the murder rate and that murder is good and that crime is something to be glorified. Then in the same breath, in a previous video, in another video, he's saying, well, even though Donald Trump didn't actually say the words, we're going to go do something violent when it comes to the Capitol riots. We knew what he meant, and we know that there was a direct causal relationship between what he said and what they did. So I hate to harp on the hypocrisy thing and the double standard thing, but it's such a prevalent theme. It's such a prevalent theme. On the one hand, Donald Trump, who doesn't explicitly call for violence, who says in his actual speech, we're going to go peacefully protest. He goes, I know what you said, but that's not what you meant. And I know that even though you didn't say those words specifically, they had a direct causal relationship between what the people did at the Capitol and what you said. But then they can't bring themselves to acknowledge the obvious fact that hip hop music does contribute to the violence because they explicitly call for it. He stops just short of acknowledging that directly. What I want to say is that I don't even need to make a specific comment about whether either one of those perspectives is correct or not. The point that I want to make is that he is clearly not using the same standard to judge one as he is to judge the other. And this is the very definition of partiality. If the Bible says that we shouldn't seek to be teachers because teachers will receive the greater condemnation, right? We have to be careful with our words. Our words mean something. And if you're going to put yourself out there as a person who is an instructor of the wise, right? A person who is an expositor of wisdom, then you have to use logical means that are solid. You have to be honest, and you can't use unjust weights and unjust measures. You can't use double standards. And so what I want to say to and about KB and Ameen, I'm doing this because I expect more. I expect better because you guys are capable. You're obviously brilliant. You're obviously smart. But if you're going to be in this fight, if you're going to be the sort of social commentators that elevate the understanding of our people and the body of Christ in general, or in particular, I should say, then I think we got to do better. I think we can do better. And that is my hope and prayer for you. If you like this video, if you found this commentary helpful, like and subscribe, share this with somebody you know. And of course, leave a comment because I like to hear critiques. Tell me what I'm doing. Tell me what you like. Tell me what you don't like. Tell me if these videos are too long. Tell me if my voice isn't clear. Tell me whatever you want to tell me. Just put something in the comments below. Leave me some feedback because I want to make sure these videos are beneficial for everyone listening. Till next time, friends, God bless you, and thanks for watching.